You gotta understand, the enemy's not the man, it's the mindset. Killing my people that's in a similar to COVID. No sense, how you take a life without a motive? Tired of seeing protest, dying to see progress. For the person that'll win in the end, doesn't really matter what's the color of the skin. When the bullets scatter, when they bleed from within, haven't we shed more blood than these tears?
Welcome to, for now, is the finale of Shop Talk. I hope you're all excited to be here. Like I said, my name is Brittany Schock. I'm the Engagement and Solutions Editor at Richland Source. And the second part of my title is really important for tonight because that's what we're going to be talking about is solutions. And it's really difficult because this is, we're going to be talking about some difficult topics and they're huge topics, right? And it's really hard to think, gosh, like we're not going to come up with a solution in, the 90 minutes that we're going to be here today, but you have to take the first steps, right? And then I think part of these conversations is, the first part of that. So glad you're all here. And we're going to dive right in. So the first thing I think that's important when you're talking about solutions is identifying what the problem is, because we have to know what the problem is before we know how to solve it. So one thing that I would love to hear from you guys, if you think about your own personal lives, especially when it comes to race relations, which is what we're here to talk about, what are some challenges that you experience in your own personal life that you wish other people knew about?
Well, if I can speak first, most of you don't know I'm a pastor. I started a church almost 7 years ago. In September, it'll be 7 years. And one of the things I'm working on a project, I was in the process of buying a building. And I wanted to do something for special needs kids because my wife and I, we have 3 daughters and we have one that's special needs. And so I was in the process of talking to some people on the south end of Mansfield to purchase a building. Well, people, because my mission statement had dealing with people that's coming out of prison, I'm incorporating everything in the mission for what I have. And people were scared about that. And so we got to another topic and I said, well, I'm just trying to better the neighborhood, do something on this south end of Mansfield. And a gentleman said, well, I don't want you in my neighborhood. Older white gentleman. I said, sir, I'm already in your neighborhood. I stay 3 minutes away from you. And so, that's just the first time as an adult being 45, experiencing racism, pretty much, and no one in the room disagreed. And then when everything was over, his wife said, my husband's not really like that. I'm saying, okay, lady, you expect me to believe that? Come on. And so it's one thing I always learned, no matter how far you go in life, no matter, what you do in life, you always, as a black man, you always gonna come into that confrontation of someone of the other race that has an old mindset, I like to say, and don't want to move with the times. So it wasn't nothing new to me. I kind of, cried, shed some tears, because I'm like, you should want somebody to bring something in this part of the city that will help everybody. And it's going for the kids, not necessarily for the adults. And so that's my experience just in the last few weeks here. It's just been recent.
This just happened?
Yes, just happened. Now, I was with the Madison Township. We were at the building on Possum Run Road where they have their meetings there for township meetings. So.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Well, I have a son that my wife and I took in when he turned 18. He was an African-American kid. His mom was in prison serving 13 years for armed robbery, and his father was deceased, and he was about to turn 18 and he hadn't even started his senior year. So my wife and I, we have 4 boys of our own, so we decided, hey, we're going to take this 18-year-old young man into our home and mentor him and try to make sure that he finishes school. And so he was with us for about 5 years, and he went into the military about 5 years ago. And my wife and I went out and we visited with him just this past week, and in a time of discussion, we were talking about the issues that are going on right now, and he said, "Dad, there's so much racism even in the military." And I see that you're a veteran. I'm a veteran, and it shocked me to hear him say it that candidly, that he sees racism every day. Even in the military, and the military is supposed to be, we're all supposed to be equal. We're all on the same team, and it when I was in, I didn't see it. So, but I'm not coming from his vantage point either. So I really had an epiphany or an eye-opening moment there this past weekend.
I think that's where we are. We're in a time of awakening right now, of people recognizing things. And I know for myself, I had a self-righteous attitude about it for a really long time. I'm the great-great-grandson of a KKK officer. And I thought of myself as being better than my great-great-grandfather because I don't hate anybody.
Right.
And so since I don't hate anybody, I'm not a racist. Yeah. And coming out of Appalachia, where didn't really have a whole lot of black people around me, and so it was as I began to realize that there were certain assumptions that I made, and for a while I was dating a wonderful young woman that was black, and she liked me. Or at least I think she did, because she invited me to go home and visit her family.
Oh, when you get that, and you like.
Well, then she had failed to make a very important announcement to her family, and that was that I was white. And we showed up at her doorstep, and her dad comes to the door, and he wouldn't let me in the door. And at the time, I got really angry, because that's directed at me. He hates me, and then I began to realize as I thought about it, and as time went on, and I got some more perspective in life, I realized that something made him that way. He didn't just wake up one day and go, my daughter's never going to date a white guy. Right. I treated her really well. We got along really well. I was very respectful to her. But that was for me the beginning of beginning to recognize that racism often isn't even about your intentions. It's not maybe about hatred in your heart. It's about the impact. And I think as we are in this time of awakening right now, I think for the first time a lot of people are becoming aware, especially as we look at policies and we look for what are some of the solutions. We realize it's not as obvious as it once was about tearing down Jim Crow laws. Right? Instead, we have policies that are racist in their impact. They disproportionately impact minority communities, and that's where we got to be looking. So it's a time of awakening, because a lot of us, we haven't been aware.
I think one of the things, and you and I have talked about this before, Micah, is it seems like 40, 50 years ago we were experiencing overt racism. There were overt laws that were specifically geared towards people of a different race. But now it seems like it's a little bit more covert. It's a little bit more in the shadows. It's a little bit more sneaky, I guess. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest problems that I see is that we're trying to fight covert racism, which is hidden. Yep. And so that's one of the biggest problems that I see facing us right now today.
I always say this, like for my wife, for instance, she's been on her job very long, just about as long as the people that's above her. And she got overlooked by 3 different white guys and had less time than her. She got all the degrees. She got masters, couple bachelors, and they wouldn't give her the job. And then when she told them that she was going to leave, they said, okay, now we have to do something to compensate her because she's put all this time in, and we've invested so much time to her going to trainees and different things of that sort. And so they gave her the job eventually because she had to go and say something. She said, I've been overlooked. I'm highly qualified. These guys only been here a year, less than that, and they get put in this position. But when you go back to where you're saying the covert, one of the things I always say to people, when people like they say, well, we had a black, well, you guys had a black president. That's undercover racism when you say that, because what you're saying is, what more do you want? You already had a president. Then I had another guy say, well, Lamont, you guys get all the jobs. Where? I just gave you an instance where my wife was overlooked several times before she got her job. And so, like you were saying, you had to take a minute and take a look back. Why is this man like this? Because like you said, we're not born that way. When we come out as babies, you put two babies together. You put a Chinese baby together, you put a white baby together, you put a black baby together. Those three babies will play with each other. Mm-hmm. And when they grow up, they'll be like David Chappelle. They won't even think of color. You remember David Chappelle when he played the Klansman? He was blind, didn't know he was black. You know, talking about white power. He didn't know, and that's how kids are. But once they get hooked into society, and society put those clutches and those vice grips on them, then they understand what color and racism is. But when they was babies growing up, they never knew. I never knew about white and black until I started having kids that, as I got older, my teenage year, start calling me the N. I said, oh, okay, this was racism. My parents was telling me about this.
You know, and to speak to that, for me, my experience has been, as a black man coming up, it was always I had to prove myself a little bit more than my counterparts, because there was always like a doubt, and there was always like a I don't want to call it a ceiling, but it is there. There's an expectation, a lower expectation of me versus someone else. So it's always I have to work a little bit harder than the next man in order to achieve the same thing that the next man does, and it goes to what all three of you have been talking about, and that's that systemic, covert racism that we experience here in today's society. You know.
I said that to my, and to your point there, as I was mentoring my son, that my wife and I had taken in. We didn't adopt him, but he's my son. He calls me Dad. He's my son. But one of the things that I told him was, I said, Vince, if the other guys are wearing a polo shirt, you're going to wear a suit.
Right.
You're going to wear a suit to the interview, and you're going to speak properly, and you're going to present yourself in a way that's better than the other guy, because you have to. I said, if you're walking down the street beside somebody and that person is a derelict, then everything that person did attaches to you when somebody sees them, because you're connected to them. I said, well, you need to be careful who you hang out with. And it took me several years to get this stuff through to him. And he brought that up to me just last month. We were talking. He said, you've even said it yourself, Dad. I have to work harder than the other guys. And he is right. He is right.
I just want to commend you and your wife on taking him in, especially at that late in age. Normally, I see couples like you and your wife that take them when they 3, 4, babies. But just to take him in at 18?
I knew him. I was a school teacher.
Okay.
I was a school teacher, and he had been a student of mine for 3 years in different classes. I also had a window cleaning company, and he was a helper of mine. And so he was in a bad situation. He had been through 11 different foster homes throughout his life. And he just told me the horror stories, and he was living with a single woman, and he was sleeping on her couch, didn't even have a proper bed. He said, Dad, he said, Mr. Hoskins, I've never had a bed.
Right.
Oh, I'm thinking, this got to stop. And he was about to turn 18. I didn't want to see him thrown out of the system and end up in jail.
Right.
And so I looked at my wife one day. I said, honey, we got to take him in. And so my middle son gave up his room. We got a full-size, queen-size bed for him that he had never had before. And he'll tell you, he said, Dad, before I came to stay with you, I didn't even know what a family looked like. I didn't know what a dad was supposed to do. I didn't know what a mom was supposed to do. I didn't know what a husband and a wife was supposed to look like, how that was supposed to work. Right. He's married now. He's got 3 amazing kids. His wife is fantastic. I've never seen him so happy. But he's making his own way, and he is really working hard in the military. He just hit a great promotion, and he's got himself into a position where he can make $100,000 a year when he comes out, just with the training that he's gotten. Right. But again, he's had to work harder than other guys, even in the military.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
To get ahead.
Yeah.
He's had to, when something heavy needs lifted, he's the guy that goes over and lifts it.
Yeah.
Because he knows that he needs to work harder.
Well, see, that's one of the things. Like, I work, as well as I pastor, I work at Newman Technology. And one of the things I always understood as a young man, especially coming out of the military, is that you want to make your superiors happy when they see you. And should be the mentality. It's sad, but we as young black men and even black women, we have to make sure that our superiors are happy to see us and not say, well, man, here he come. I wish he would find another job. You know, because he show up every day, but he's a good worker, but he just, you know, we as black people, we have to not show our emotions most of the time. You know, we have to be more reserved when somebody else, you know, Micah could be at work working right beside me, he can go off and get mad and there'd be no issue. But because we seem more volatile, more violent people, and because we known for just, you know, bad things, when things come against us, you know, and it shouldn't be that stereotype. It should be, if Micah's a nice guy, you should be able to know he's a nice guy, and not because he's maybe a different color or a different race or whatever.
You raise a good point, you know, and I mean, what we're talking about, right, is we're talking about white privilege here, and you know, and that's a phrase and a term that in and of itself for me was hard. I couldn't get over it. I couldn't get past this idea of white privilege. And for me, you know, my dad was in the military when I was real young. We moved around a lot. By the time I graduated or didn't graduate from high school, you know, by the time I was out of the house, I'd already lived in 20 houses. You know, we moved around constantly across different states and all over Ohio. And, you know, I didn't graduate high school. I didn't get a college degree. I was an addict. By the time I was 21, I was homeless, and I worked my way out of that. And so by the time I got to even where I am today, you know, someone tell me that I've got white privilege and be like hell I do. You know, I worked my butt off in order to get here. You can't tell me that I've got privilege. But you just touched on it. You talked about that emotional aspect. You know, when I got the job that I have today, and what originally made me really good at my job was I always played with a chip on my shoulder. I was always angry. And so I was always the guy that when it got into meetings, I got stuff done because I just put my head down. Now, it also there for a while was keeping me from being able to get any further, because guess what? That's not real good people skills. No. But the fact I was even able to get to that point, the very traits that made me effective in that role, I think you're right. I think that for someone who had an identical story to mine up to that point, if they exhibited those kind of characteristics, if it was a black man, would have a challenge getting hired into such a role.
You know, and part of what he's speaking to is a non-understanding of culture. I mean, I grew up slapboxing. I grew up. If me and him was, we'd be talking about each other's mamas, or you know. But it's a norm. It's the what is perceived by others as aggression is our normal interactions with each other. And so a lot of what he is speaking about in terms of the passion, in terms of not being able to get angry, it's not, you know, we are passionate people, and we can be loud, boisterous people, but it's not usually anger. It's just that's how, you know, I grew up in a house where my mother screamed all day long. I did that too. Right. You know, so a lot of that is just not understanding of other cultures, and not like you said, you grew up not around black people. You know, so when you do not see us interacting amongst each other, and then we're off somewhere and you see it looks odd to different people, and you know, and it creates that where they're hostile people. Right. They're, you know, so I think that's one of the ways, you you know, because I know this is solutions. So, you know, that's one of the ways that I believe we can begin to break down those barriers is understanding and really getting to know a different culture other than yourself. Yeah.
That takes effort. You have to be intentional about
Mm-hmm.
it.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right, yeah.
That doesn't just happen organically.
Beth, I would love to hear your perspective about what we've been talking about, unconscious biases and unconscious racism that you might not even realize that you're doing, right? That kind of the covert things that we've been talking about over and over again. I would love to hear your perspective because I know that, you know, from what you've studied and what you've observed.
Well, you started off with the question of sort of what we want, and what was it again? Like what you wanted to know.
Yeah, like a challenge
want
you've
someone to know.
experienced in your own life.
Challenge. Yeah, you know, it's I mean, for real, like, it's hard. I'm not good at dialogue because I've spent my whole life since I grew up here being obsessed with and then making you know, how is it that we just, you know, we build a country on lies and lack of historical information, and then suddenly it's a shock, right? Like it's just very difficult. Like I'm an expert, you know, and I don't like saying it that, but you know, I have a PhD and I'm like, call me Beth, but if, you know, you're an asshole, call me doctor, you know. At the time, because there's sexism and racism and there's multiple intersections, all of that. But for me, it's, you know, it doesn't come, like I'm not angry, I'm just so anxious where I'm like, damn, we need to teach this stuff. It's not, like, but that's the point, we made it disappear, we made it ancillary. It's not, instead of like dealing with like the original sins of the country, of genocide and enslavement, we're all going, oh, you know, suddenly it's, you know, and when you say it's like an awakening, it's really challenging too, because it's like an awakening for a whole lot of white people. For a whole lot of other folks, they're going, you know, it's like, you know, and it varies, you know, and I can, you know, think of all the things that shaped me here where I was trying to figure out how to talk about what we now, like a racial literacy, like how can we communicate with each other? How can we value it so that we can learn about like culture and cultural difference and these things and give people tools, because right now what we're doing is it's like we're just fighting each other with words we don't even really know, you know? And so it's, you know, my very first job was working for the President's Initiative on Race. Clinton had this initiative on race. No one ever heard about it, right? It got disappeared historically. It was my first job. I was like, this is it. And then Monica Lewinsky happened, and you know, but that's all part of it, is it's this like diversion tactic. And so it's challenging because I'm glad I'm here where I grew up, the place that shaped me into like spending the rest of my life working on these issues. And now that they're happening so fast, it's hard because you've got all these people in your life where you just want to go, you know, because it's so important. That's why, you know, like there's things that we can do, and this is critical, but it's got to be systemic and bigger, and we have to figure out how to work around it together. And people are gonna, like the gentleman who was just like, I don't want you in my neighborhood. Right. You're like, you know, it's just like, cool, somebody's still just that bald face in your face. You know, that's, I mean, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, but it's like, that's easy. Old school racism and what we think is like the KKK dude, you know, but I'm like, what we're talking about are just very serious systems that have been built up so long. We now have the biggest movement in the history of the modern world to change it. And half of Mansfield's still going, huh, what? Right. You know, and so that part of me is like, you know, I appreciate it. I just realize when I'm here, like this is what I teach, the history of like how race is constructed and racism is built, and all these systems get moved together. But then that stuff gets so politicized that people think it's just about an opinion. Now, opinions matter and lived experiences matter, but there's actual history to it, and it's that history that's so embedded that we've erased. You know, we're not even revising a history that exists. We're creating something that's never been fully written. So,
well, I mean, you nailed it though, and talking about, you know, and to use the word from earlier, covert. You know, and when people think of, so how does racism manifest itself in our policies today? People don't think of things like, for example, that, you know, in order to braid hair, particularly in the minority community, that is something that is a viable career in and of itself, that you can provide for your family braiding hair. In Ohio, you have to have a full-blown cosmetology license to do that. 1,500 hours of training and a bunch of things that have nothing to do with hair braiding whatsoever, and which is something that is prohibitive cost-wise. Oh yeah, and has education requirements within that, especially if you're talking about in an urban setting that has failing schools in the first place. All these things that to create a threshold to do something that you learned from your mother, for crying out loud.
Yeah, some of these women have been braiding hair since they were, what, 5 years old?
Exactly. And so, I mean, and people suspect that, well, if it doesn't actually name a race in it, you know, because again, we're not talking about Jim Crow laws anymore, right? So if it doesn't say it, but in spoiler alert, you know, all the time we write laws in Ohio where it's very, very specific. It's tailored to one thing, and it never says the specific name. Just last year, we gave away $1 billion to one nuclear power company in Ohio. $1 billion, state money, to one company. Nowhere in that bill did it say the name of the company. Nowhere did it say who the owners were. It was in bankruptcy, by the way. You know, we took it out of bankruptcy court and given them that money. And not once did it ever say any of that. But that's where we have to do the hard work of looking at where is the impact. Because where the impact, and this is where for people who are brought up right of center, if they think, well, if it doesn't say anything in it that is direct at a race, then it's not a racist law. We got to get rid of that entire mentality. Look at where's the impact. Is there a disproportion? And that's where we can find common ground.
We need new words.
Yes.
And we've needed that for a long time, but it's really hard to be in a moment like this with so many things unfolding that's very new to a lot of people, and not to, you know, you could be super righteous and be all rub people's faces in it, and sometimes I really want to do that, but it's not effective. But, you know, the other part is to not put so much labor on folks who are living in a white supremacist world. And I said it. You know, that's the thing, is like we say, like we're meant to respond to saying white, like with there's like a body jerk reaction. Like people, like white folks are just, what? I'm not white. What? I don't know. White supremacy? What's that? You know, it's just, you know, so it's like, can we change the words? Now we don't want to make them meaningless, but somebody was even talking about the framework of like, you know, first degree, second degree, and third degree racism. For real, you know, but you can change, you know, that's the notion right now, is that right now we have racist, non-racist, or racist, anti-racist. Really what we're looking at is just all these, you know, systemic layers that have to be changed. And if we give it different words, is that going to help us? You know, I think, you know, like anti-bias or unconscious bias, that's the way we sort of got around having it to be too much about this anti-black or white framework. And that's a good place to start. It's just that all these systems are interrelated. So if you look at one, you know, I mean, I know you've been working on, you know, the police and community relationship for a long time now. Like that's the thing, is like there's ongoing work that needs to be done. But, you know, it's really hard to change that unless you're looking at all the systems that feed it, right? You know, and then people just have to see it as a problem. And that's the change, is that often folks are like, this is fine. It's like, no, even statistically, it's not close to fine, right? Even just the plain evidentiary-based statistics of home ownership, you know, all the aspects that mark wealth and opportunity, et cetera. But, you know, how do you do that? We have some ideas, yes?
Yeah, I think most of the time, even like you was talking about home ownership and things of that sort, a lot of times we as black men, we always try to say the white man is keeping us down. No, he's not. I'm just like you, to the point where I graduated 2 years late because my mother moved me around the country. I come out of high school at the age of 19, went and tried the military, come home early. Then I figured out that I needed a skill. And so I learned how to weld by practicing. And then the job that I worked at, they sent us to school to learn. I took every opportunity. Then when the Keyhole Center, they offered up some classes, I drove over to Shelby every night after work, learning how to do CNC, learning how to make blueprints. It starts by we encouraging everyone, black, male, female, to do better. Just like I told the gentleman about the building, I said, well, you know, Moses, when God sent Moses to free the children of Israel, and they were supposed to take over the promised land. They didn't take over the promised land because they was afraid. And it said God waited till the old generation died off to go take over the promised land. So I told the old man pretty much, I said, I'll just wait for you to die and then I'll come back and buy the building. And that's what I'm saying with the systemic racism, the covered racism. It's sad to say this, but it's gonna take our children's children for that really to move out. I mean, what we doing here tonight, we talking about it, we getting dialogue about it, but it's over time. You think about Jim Crow law. Once Martin Luther King, Malcolm X and them died, that was done with. Now you got this other stuff. And then these people die off, and then now the next generation is living a little bit better. So it may take another 2 or 3 decades before this thing really evolves into what we want to say an oasis, where like Martin Luther King said, well, we won't be worried about the color of a man, but the content of his character.